strange new idea was floated recently in a Channel 5 programme, which was described as a smoking gun. A smoking gun usually means clinching evidence in a murder mystery. So what clinching evidence were they talking about? First of all, let's set the scene. The programme was trying to prove that Richard III murdered the so-called princes in the tower. For more about the princes, please see our earlier videos. However, while they were supposed to have been put to death, Richard was hundreds of miles away, on tour, somewhere between Warwickshire and Yorkshire. So the smoking gun couldn't be placed in Richard's hand. They were trying to accuse someone else of doing the crime for him. Of course, there's no evidence that any such murder ever took place. It's all speculation. And the evidence newly brought to light by the Missing Princes project all points to the princes reappearing when they were older, which evidently provoked this television show to try to prove there really was a murder, which they can't. No one can. But the programme makers had an influential figure on their side, William Shakespeare, whose play 100 years later named the chief murderer as Sir James Tyrrell. This accusation can be traced back to a string of Tudor chronicles that Shakespeare used for his material, but most historians are very wary of simply believing these chronicles for two reasons. First, because the Tudor chronicles were just that, Tudor, and written long after King Richard's death. No accusation of the prince's murder appeared in England before Henry Tudor and his army invaded and killed King Richard. The murder accusations arrived with the Tudor rebels. Second, all those Tudor writers borrowed from each other and simply repeated what the others said, which was what the Tudor government wanted them to say. Those writers weren't researchers. They produced no evidence. They were storytellers. The name of James Tyrrell came to be used in gossipy Tudor stories by writers like Thomas More and Edward Hall. It was said by More that Tyrrell confessed, but historians can find no documentary record that supports this story. It's just another accusation. The qualified researchers of the Richard III Society know perfectly well who Tyrrell really was, and they have written a blog post that exposes the smoking gun for its inaccuracies. The so-called damning discovery brought out in 5 minutes at the end of the show was not new, as they claimed. It is a well-known document, the will of a private person, Margaret Capel, who died in 1522 during the reign of Henry VIII. She was the widow of a moneylender, William Capel. Margaret left a small item to her son, described in the will as her husband's chain that was young King Edward V. Those few words are the entire description. It's a chain. But the television programme concluded, without any evidence, that this was a chain of office. Now let's look at the holes in this argument, because an item of value in a will would have been very carefully described and in detail, for obvious reasons. They called it a chain of office, with the inference that it was gold and bejewelled, as would befit a royal prince. But in 1522, this would have been called a collar or a livery collar. the mere word chain on its own does not mean a collar. So was it made of precious metal? No indication. Was it decorated with gems? No indication. Was it large or small? No indication. Next, having assumed chain meant something it didn't, the programme went on to assume it genuinely had belonged to Edward V. We can certainly believe it belonged to Margaret Capel's husband, the moneylender and pawnbroker. But should we believe what his customers told him when trying to make the items they pawned seemed more valuable? Where's the rigorous research that supports provenance to Edward V? So far, no trace of this chain exists anywhere else, before or since. Then came the programme's triumphant conclusion. One of Margaret's brothers-in-law was Sir James Tyrrell. Join the dots. And Tyrrell must have got the chain by murdering the princes. So this was no smoking gun. Everything supposedly found was already in the public domain, published between 1543 to 1826 to 1933 to 2021. The only thing new was a desperately overstretched interpretation that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The programme was hinged, without proof, on a string of assumptions, desperately bent to fit the pre-existing accusation that viewers were told to believe. This was the 500-year-old story that the princes were murdered in 1483 and that Tyrrell was their murderer. That underlying story was never questioned. Hence, we can safely say that if any part of this story was incorrect, then the programme was built on a nonsense. Thank you, and we hope that this short film has been helpful.